Next, we are welcoming up Zainab. She's going to be talking about the silent pandemic. Hi, Zainab. If you can just share your screen for me, and then I will set you up. Excellent. Okay, good.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Zainab, and I'm a fourth-year microbiology student at the University of Glasgow. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the focus of my dissertation, which was on antimicrobial resistance. Antimicrobial resistance occurs as a result of mutations within microbes such as bacteria, viruses, and parasites that allow them to evolve mechanisms which allows them to resist the action of antimicrobial drugs such as antibiotics. Antimicrobial resistance was associated with 3.57 million deaths in 2019, and unfortunately, this number is continuing to rise. The lack of public awareness of this crisis and its associated mortality rates are what makes it a silent pandemic. So all begins with the discovery of penicillin in 1928, which was heralded as the golden age of antibiotics, where superficial wounds no longer had fatal consequences and infections such as tuberculosis and pneumonia could be cured. However, Alexander Fleming warned the unnecessary and overexposure of these microbes to antibiotics would allow them to adapt and evolve resistance. This image shows the antibiotic discovery and resistance timeline. So here in 1928, we have discovery of penicillin, and further down the line, we have discovery of some other antibiotics, such as the tetracyclines. Now, unfortunately, in 1940, we had the first recorded instance of penicillin resistance. So you can see that antimicrobial resistance is a very rapid process. Also important to note, all the antibiotics that are on this image, there has been some level of resistance observed towards them all. So we are currently here. Unfortunately, we're in the middle of a discovery void where no new class of antibiotics has been introduced in the past 30 years. So I'm going to talk a bit more about how resistance actually develops. Resistance occurs as a result of mutations in DNA of microbes or the transfer of DNA that has resistance genes between different species of microbes. However, human action also plays a significant role in this crisis. Overuse of antimicrobials is a significant problem, as continuous exposure of a microbe to a specific drug will allow them to adapt. So initially, an antimicrobial will be prescribed to treat the bacteria or viruses responsible for the infection, and at the beginning of treatment, some of the bacteria and viruses will be killed. However, a small number of these microbes will be able to evolve resistance due to continuous exposure to the specific drug. They will then go on to replicate and form more bacterial colonies or viral particles that are also resistant. This causes sustained infection in the host and also recurrent infections where symptoms begin to subside at the beginning of treatment but will reappear again at the end of treatment or even after the course of antibiotics is finished. It has been recorded that self-medication with antibiotics is more prevalent in lower to middle income countries. And this is an image of the world map that shows that Asia, followed by Africa, is predicted to have the highest mortality rates due to AMR by 2050. Approximately 76% of the antibiotic usage increase between 2000 and 2010 was attributed to BRIC countries. So this is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. There's no singular reason for higher levels of antibiotic usage in these countries. Firstly, infectious diseases are more common, now the leading cause of death in many of these lower income countries, and subsequently increased antibiotic usage. Inadequate sanitation and poorly developed sewage disposal systems increase the exposure of individuals to pathogenic bacteria and viruses. Unfortunately, large proportions of individuals from lower income countries do live in extreme poverty. That means they have reduced access to quality healthcare and often have to turn to cheaper alternatives such as purchasing over-the-counter antibiotics in an attempt to self-medicate. There are also reduced regulations on antibiotic production, dispensing, safety, and quality of these drugs. Although the sale of non-prescription antibiotics is illegal within the European Union, it was found that approximately 7% of antibiotic usage in these countries was non-prescription. The highest percentage was seen in Romania at 20%, followed by Greece at 19%. Despite the ban on purchasing non-prescription antibiotics, antibiotic use and resistance is still increasing in Europe, and this can be put down to overprescription and patient expectations. Oftentimes, patients are given antibiotics without determining determining which microbe is actually causing the infection. Antibiotics are only effective against bacteria, but they are sometimes used to treat symptoms of colds and flus, which are normally caused by viruses, so the antibiotics aren't going to be doing anything. Surveys have also found that approximately 55% of GPs felt pressure from patients to prescribe antibiotics even when they were not displaying the correct symptoms. Therefore, antibiotic resistance will be present at different levels across the world, depending on the extent of use, availability of drugs, and also infection rates. Although resistant infections can be caused by viruses, parasites, and fungi, the major contributor to this crisis is bacteria, which can be categorized into two groups based on the presence of an outer membrane. Cell membranes act as a barrier to substances exiting and entering cells and are also present in plant and animal cells. Gram-negative bacteria possess a double membrane, so they have an inner membrane and an outer membrane, whilst gram-positive bacteria do not. The majority of antimicrobial drugs need to cross this outer membrane and accumulate inside the bacteria in order to kill it. However, the impermeable nature of the outer membrane makes this incredibly difficult. There are certain components present within the outer membrane that are integral for conferring resistance to gram-negative bacteria. These can be specific proteins, fatty molecules, or specialized carbohydrates, and these are often the target of many antibiotics. These components can be modified or replaced altogether, which prevents the antibiotics from being able to bind to their correct substrates, inhibiting their uptake into the bacterial cell. The presence of the outer membrane is the main challenge faced in generating new antimicrobials active against gram-negative bacteria. Some of the most dangerous bacteria are gram-negatives, such as E. coli and Salmonella, which are associated with food poisoning, but actually Salmonella bacteria are responsible for causing typhoid fever, which is a very serious bacterial infection. So you can see why antimicrobial resistance is such a problem. If individuals are infected with these dangerous resistant bacteria, there are very few antibiotics left that can be used to treat them, and even these are not as efficient as they once were. Resistant bacteria were directly responsible for 1.27 million deaths in 2019, and the mortality rate is set to increase to 10 million by 2050 as no action is taken. This is greater than the total mortality rates caused by cancer. 2050 may seem like it's a while away, but it's actually a very short period of time, and we have to start making changes now if we want to avoid this crisis from expanding. You may also be wondering why awareness of this crisis hasn't spread, considering the very high mortality rates. This is why it's called a silent pandemic, because many people don't know about it. Over the past 2 years, the main infectious disease being discussed in the media has been the coronavirus, so the antimicrobial resistance pandemic has taken a bit of a backseat. Government campaigns and educational programs in school have also not been great, because in the past it wasn't considered a major problem by people that did not work within infection biology. The other problem is that research on antimicrobial drugs, such as discovering new antibiotics, is not very lucrative for pharmaceutical companies, and they don't make a considerable profit from these drugs, as antibiotics are relatively cheap to purchase. For example, if you have an individual with a bacterial infection, all they have to do is see their GP, and they're usually prescribed a 1-week course of antibiotics and the infection is resolved. However, if you have an individual with asthma, they'll be relying on their inhaler for the rest of their lives, and the pharmaceutical company will continue to profit for a very long time. It's the same case for patients with diabetes, high cholesterol, and high blood pressure, and the drugs used in these patients tend to be much more profitable. However, despite this, there have been significant advances in generation of new antimicrobials against gram-negative bacteria. The approach for developing these new drugs is by targeting components of the outer membrane that I previously mentioned. I want to focus on a novel antibiotic called darobactin, and it's a really interesting example because it could indicate the arrival of an entirely new class of antibiotics, which is something we haven't had in the past 30 years. It has been very effective in the lab and in animal models, and it works by interacting with one of the components of the outer membrane. It interacts with a specific complex which is responsible for producing proteins that are essential for bacterial function and survival. It's quite a unique drug as it doesn't have to cross the outer membrane or enter the cell, it just interacts externally with the component of the outer membrane. It's been shown to be very effective against E. coli and Salmonella and was able to completely cure infection in mice. So it's a very promising new example, and hopefully we'll be seeing this used in hospitals and GP surgeries very soon. Finally, I'd like to discuss one more example of a new drug, and it's called SLAP S25, which is a bit of an unusual name, but it has a very high efficiency during testing in the lab. It's really an alternative to antibiotics because it's an entirely different class of compounds. It's an antimicrobial peptide, which are essentially just proteins secreted by one species of bacteria to kill another closely related species to reduce competition for nutrients. What researchers have done is they were able to extract this protein from bacteria and modify it into a form that can be used to treat infections in humans and animals. It's a very interesting example of an alternative drug because, unfortunately, we have observed resistance towards all of our antibiotics, and having an entirely different compound would be very useful. This is a close-up image of the outer membrane and shows how SLAP S25 interacts with one of the components of the outer membrane. Its target is a specialised carbohydrate molecule. It's actually able to pass through the outer membrane and accumulate within the cell. In doing so, it causes significant ruptures in the outer membrane and damages it, and this leads to the bacteria bursting and essentially breaking apart so that it's no longer able to sustain infection within the host. I hope this talk has helped to illustrate why antimicrobial resistance is a silent pandemic and also why urgent action is required. We have to strive to reduce our global antibiotic usage, especially when antibiotics are not the appropriate treatment. And we have to improve our awareness of this crisis, especially in schools, universities, and other workplace environments. New drugs are currently in clinical testing, but there is still some time before they are approved for use in GPs, surgeries, and hospitals. If we bring all of this information together and put it into practice, hopefully we should be able to overcome this crisis before 2050 and significantly reduce mortality rates. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Zainab. That's super interesting. It's funny, actually. I remember learning about the antibiotic crisis myself in a talk in Let's Talk About X years ago, and it's so interesting to see how the research has changed and developed over the last few years. And I think it's so important that we kind of keep this kind of silent pandemic, as you rightly call it, in mind, definitely. So we've got a question in the Q&A. So you were talking about the profitability of antibiotics and how the pharmaceutical companies aren't so keen on maybe working on those because of that. So do you think that Big Pharma has had a detrimental effect on natural remedies and this weakened the natural human immune system?
So I definitely think that natural remedies have kind of been put to the back and not really appreciated as much. But if you actually look at where all of our medication began when the first antibiotic was discovered, the first antibiotic, penicillin, is actually a natural product because it's secreted by a special type of fungus. So it's not a synthetic compound. And also a lot of our drugs, their chemical structures are based on natural components. So it's definitely important to appreciate where our drugs came from. And I definitely think natural substitutes are still useful. The only problem is when the infections become very severe, like they enter the bloodstream, then that's a bit of a problem, and you have to look to stronger alternatives such as the synthetic drugs that the pharmaceutical companies are making.
Sure, thank you so much. And do you think that GP surgeries are more aware now about the problems of over-prescribing antibiotics? And I'd like to add actually to that, do you think the public are more aware?
I think compared to when I was at school, people are definitely more aware of antibiotic resistance. I have seen a few adverts on TV about it, but not as much as there should be. I think GP surgeries are a bit more aware of it, but they are still, prescription of antibiotics is still very high. Like I'd mentioned, a lot of people are given antibiotics based on symptoms, so we don't actually know if it's actually a bacteria that's even causing that infection. But that, to find that out would be more time consuming, and obviously it'd be more expensive as well. So I think awareness has increased, but it's still not at the level that it should be, considering how high the mortality rates are because of this crisis. So hopefully that will increase more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. If everyone in the audience can join me by congratulating Zainab on a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.